When you are surrounded by gunfire and mortars and RPGs, you keep running. My name is Christina Lamb and I am Chief Foreign Correspondent for the Sunday Times. I became a foreign correspondent really because of a wedding. So when I left university, I worked as an intern at the Financial Times, and one day the foreign editor was supposed to be going to a lunch of South Asian politicians, and last minute he couldn't go, so he said, "Why don't you go?" So I went to this lunch and sat next to the Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party, and he asked me if I would like to interview Benazir Bhutto, who was then living in London in exile. Of course, I said yes. So he arranged this interview, and the day that I went to interview her was the day that she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So her flat was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers. We got on very well. She then went back to Pakistan to try and raise a movement for democracy. And I went to work for Central TV in Birmingham as a trainee reporter. And one day I came home from work, and on my doormat was the most beautiful gold-inscribed invitation that I had ever seen. And it was to her wedding in Karachi. I'd never been to Pakistan, and it was like something out of Arabian Nights, very colourful, but also very political. I thought this was absolutely fascinating and couldn't really imagine going back and covering local news in Birmingham. So I came back and gave him my notice, and then I went to live in Pakistan. I lived in Peshawar and started travelling with the Mujahideen who were fighting the Russians, and I would go in and out of Afghanistan with them and report on it. So since then I've covered all sorts of conflict in Angola, in Mozambique, in Iraq, Syria, Libya, South America and Colombia. Basically most of the wars of the last 20 or 30 years I was reporting. It's a dangerous job, and so I have had some narrow escapes. The one that felt the most dangerous, where I really didn't think we were going to get out alive, was in 2006 when I was with 3 British paratroopers who were the first combat troops sent to Helmand in southern Afghanistan. We went into this village and started talking to people, and I thought it was odd that there were no children when we went into the village, because kids always come up and ask for candy and things. So I actually mentioned this to the commander of B Company who I was with. And so he asked them, and they said, "Oh no, people were at the mosque praying." In fact, later we realised it wasn't prayer time. Anyway, he had this meeting with them discussing what they needed, whether there were any Taliban around. He said no. And then we left, and he was saying to me, "Well, that seemed to go quite well. I'm writing notes." And literally as he said that, the first shots rang out. We were a group of 45 soldiers and myself and a photographer, and 15 of them had stayed outside of the village, and they had been ambushed. Everyone just ran and jumped into all these irrigation ditches, and we were all like split up. People didn't even have like helmets on. And I dropped my notebook. I really have never lost a notebook in all my years of being a journalist. I started to climb out of this ditch to get the notebook back, and a RPG went so close to me that like my hair lifted, so I left the notebook. It quickly became clear that we were actually totally surrounded by Taliban, and every direction we ran in they were firing at us, and I couldn't really see how we were going to get out, and nor I think could the soldiers I was with. We ended up having to fight our way out. For two and a half hours we were running through these fields, these muddy fields with like bullets coming all around us. It was maybe 50 centigrade. and I dropped my water, so it was really hard running in that heat. But when you are surrounded by gunfire and mortars and RPGs, you keep running. The group that we'd left outside with the vehicles and the big guns, they managed to get out of their ambush, so they actually fired on a big group of Taliban and took them out. If one person had been injured and we'd had to slow down, we would probably have all got killed, so we were very lucky. I've always focused on what happens to women in war. People will say there's always been rape in war, which is true, but it seems to me that we're seeing sexual violence used as a weapon of war increasingly. I cannot think of a single conflict anywhere at the moment where it isn't being used. I think the first time I really became aware of how massive a problem this was, and also how terrible it is for the people that suffer this, was in 2014 when the Chibok girls who were taken from their school in the middle of the night in Nigeria became the biggest story on earth for like 2 weeks, and then everybody moved on. And by the way, half those girls are still missing. But when I travelled around northeast Nigeria, I found that thousands of women and girls had been taken by Boko Haram. Even when they'd been rescued, some of them by Nigerian military, they'd been raped again by the soldiers. Then when they were taken back to their communities in displacement camps, often the communities wouldn't take them back because they saw them as solid or brainwashed. So around that same time, there was the ISIS fighters going into Yazidi villages in Iraq, northern Iraq, and killing men and boys, and then taking young girls and women to be sex slaves, basically, taking them to kind of like really slave markets where people would then come and choose whether they were beautiful or ugly, or, you know, they were kind of categorized. And some of those girls escaped eventually, or were rescued by brave people and told their stories, and really the most horrific stories that I'd ever heard. And then in 2017, 3 years after that, I was covering the Rohingya people that were fleeing the attacks by the Burmese army and Buddhist militias in Burma or Myanmar. And about 700,000 people fled in 3 months, many of them women and children. And every woman I spoke to had stories of being tied to banana trees and gang raped. So you had these 3 particular really big issues where the people had spoken and come out, even though it's so difficult, and yet nothing happened. In fact, one of the Yazidi girls sent me a WhatsApp message saying, "We told our story, what difference did it make?" And I couldn't answer the question. So I started really looking into this and was very shocked to find that nobody had been prosecuted in any of these cases. So I started collecting these more and more of these stories, and collected them all in a book called Our Bodies, Their Battlefields. And this is such an epidemic that even though that book only came out 5 years ago, I've already updated it twice to include other countries, namely Ukraine and Israel, Palestine. People would no doubt say that Sudan should also now be part of it. I think I could really spend the rest of my life going into these places. It is incredibly frustrating because there is more awareness of it now, and the laws are there, but it requires the political will to actually properly implement it, and we're not seeing that at the moment. One of the things that bothers me a lot is what difference it makes. I'm taking risks, I'm putting people at risk. Does it actually make a difference? But just this week I've been with some Ukrainian women who are survivors of sexual violence, and they feel very strongly that actually telling the stories matter. I always remember one young Yazidi girl who was telling me her story, and it was really horrific. And I said to her, "You don't need to do this, we can stop." And she said, "No, I don't want anybody to be able to say they didn't know." And So I suppose that's what I try to make sure that people know about what's happening, and try and shine a light on some of the things that maybe people find uncomfortable, such as sexual violence. But I think people need to know about it, otherwise it will not change.